Right into it. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm here to host tonight's event with William Robinson, joined in conversation by Professor Hilborn A. Watson to discuss the release of Robinson's new book, Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic, out from PM Press. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned, cooperative, and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country and around the world. So if you haven't checked us out yet, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, due to the global pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. We did just make the exciting announcement this past weekend that our co-op will be moving into a new building in late winter of 2023. The new building will have increased space and air ventilation that will allow for us to return to in-person events. We do need help at the moment with costs associated with the new building. So if you're interested in supporting our move, I'll drop a link to our crowdfunding campaign in the chat as well. And with all of that said, we do still have a list of exciting virtual events coming up, including next Thursday, July 21st, when we host another PM Press author, John P. Clark, to discuss the second edition of his book, The Impossible Community, Realizing Communitarian Anarchism. So if you're interested in signing up for that or any other events through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And a note for those of you who are attending in the live audience, tonight's speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the Facebook live stream. Great. Moving on to tonight's event and speakers. Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic provides a big picture account of how the coronavirus pandemic and new digital technologies have drastically transformed capitalism and the entire global society. Analyzing the concentration of power and control in the hands of corporate conglomerates, tech companies, mega banks, and the military-industrial complex, the book documents the extent of unprecedented global inequalities as the mass of humanity faces violent dispossession and uncertain survival. While Robinson issues a dire warning against the emergence of this dystopic digitalized dictatorship, he also finds great hope and inspiration in the burgeoning social movements of poor and working people around the world, and provides a meaningful text to those struggling on the front lines of global social justice. William I. Robinson is Distinguished Professor of Sociology, Global Studies, and Latin American Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Among his many books are Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity, Into the Tempest, Essays on the New Global Capitalism, and 2020's The Global Police State. Hilborn A. Watson is Professor Emeritus in the Department of International Relations at Bucknell University. He has 40 years of teaching experience with a focus in global political economy, philosophy, and the Caribbean. He's the author of a 3-volume series on Errol Walton Barrow and the post-war transformation of Barbados. So William Hilborn, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight. And I am going to go ahead and pass it over to William.
Well, thank you so much, Ash and Firestorm, for organizing this event, for inviting my great friend, colleague, and comrade Hilborn and myself. And in a few minutes, I'm going to turn over to Hilborn, who's is going to facilitate our discussion. But I wanted to start with a couple of anecdotes, and which really reflect why I set about to write this book in the first place. And I should say that these two anecdotes are subsequent to when I finished writing the book in early 2021. And shortly afterwards, I learned that the CEO of Pfizer, which you all know is at the very core of the corporate response to the pandemic. The CEO, Albert Bourla, announced at the World Economic Forum meeting that Pfizer had developed a new pill, and I'm quoting here, with a sensor that alerts relevant authorities when digested. So, I read this. What it allows Pfizer to do, or whoever is controlling this technology, to track patients once they've consumed some pharmaceutical. And, one of the things I discovered in writing this book is that we're emerging into this new biopolitical regime in which we're seeing a fusion of the new technologies that I discuss in the book that blur the lines between the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds. And of course, these worlds are immersed in existing power relations. So really, we don't even know when we take these medications then, and I'm not here referring to the COVID vaccines. I don't think there's any chips implanted in them at all. The point is that the CEO of Pfizer has said that they've now developed a technology in which you consume a medication and they can monitor you subsequently. So that was one anecdote which really, really hit me. The other is an article that just came out a couple of months ago in The Economist magazine. And they've titled this article, Big Brotherly Boss. And I'm going to read a very brief excerpt. But because we know that hundreds of millions of people around the world moved into homework. Of course, the majority of workers around the world didn't have that privilege, but hundreds of millions moved into working on their computers at home. And this article says, I'm quoting now, both the scope and the scale of corporate surveillance has ballooned in the past few years. The global demand for employee spying software more than doubled between April 2019 and April 2020. Within weeks of the first lockdown in March 2020, search queries for monitoring tools rose more than 18-fold. Surveillance software makers' sales jumped. At Time Doctor, which records videos of user screens or periodically snaps photos to ensure that they are at their computers, they suddenly trebled in April 2020, while those at desk time more than quadrupled. It goes on, this article, to say that employees can follow every keystroke or mouse movement, gain access to webcams and microphones, scan emails for gossip or take screenshots, leaving the surveilled worker none the wiser. Last year, Fujitsu, a Japanese technology group, unveiled artificial intelligence software which promises to gauge employees' concentration based on their facial expression. And then the article goes on to say that 60% of corporate employers are now using this spy software on workers that work in front of computers, whether at home or in the office. And another 17% are considering doing so. So really, these two anecdotes really bring home let us say, the extent to which corporate control has so much accelerated through these new technologies that I explore in the book and through the pandemic. What I wanted to do with this book is, I had been writing about the crisis of global capitalism for the last 15 years or so. And then more recently, leading up to the pandemic, I started exploring digitalization. Then the pandemic hit, and I wanted to bring these different things together. So what I discovered in this book, by way of introduction, is that the digital revolution is bringing about a massive new round of restructuring and transformation of global capitalism. And this was tremendously accelerated by the pandemic. And this transformation has opened up enormous new possibilities for transnational capital to accumulate, to make profits. Secondly, that this transformation underway has tremendously enhanced the ability of the ruling groups to exercise social control and discipline over the global working class and the popular classes around the world. That is to enhance what I've called the global police state. And third, the digital revolution underway, this radical transformation of global capitalism, turbocharged by the pandemic, is resulting in an acceleration of what was already simply unprecedented global inequalities. It's accelerating under and unemployment, the expansion of surplus humanity, and the spread of precarious and on-demand labor, while we see all over the world heightened social disintegration and the breakdown of political authority. So that is how I set what I said about to analyze, think about and analyze in this book. But finally, the most important thing I conclude with this is that the mass of humanity is not taking these transformations and the assaults that these transformations represent passively. The global revolt is underway, it's spreading. The title of the book is Global Civil War. And of course, that's a metaphor because there's not two armies facing each other on a military battlefield. But in the unbelievable upsurge in revolt, in protest worldwide is simply unprecedented and is being met on the other side by these transformations and by intensified global police states. So we're moving into this entirely new situation worldwide, and I tried to capture that in the book. Hilborn?
Yeah. Ready for me? Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill and Ash. Yes, this work, Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic, I view as a very sophisticated path-breaking study, a tour de force, so to speak, that reflects the dialectical motion of the trajectory of capitalism, marked, as we know, by radical and unprecedented change across the material, the economic, financial, production, political, and every other spheres, which, when taken together, are best understood as a moment of crisis. Crisis, as Robinson points out, signals, if you will, a break, a rupture, a form of discontinuity in the rhythm of time, a point that was made, of course, before back in the 90s by John Holloway. A discontinuity that reminds us that things simply cannot continue as usual. In effect, the restructuring is necessary if the system is to avoid a condition of atrophy, so to speak. But it is also clear that in the capitalist order, where uneven development is the norm, there is no level playing field. And therefore, these contradictions do not unfold on a global scale in an even manner. So there are some sites where things are, the crisis is much more advanced and developed in its expressions, and some areas where one wonders if in fact it is there. But I think it is important to note here that, as Robinson points out, the global pandemic is best seen as an integral part of this crisis. It's not something that has happened on the outside that we can isolate and talk about, but we have to be able to situate it within the broader process of the global capitalist crisis. In this sense, therefore, it is important to make the connections, to see the connections that are at work in shaping this trajectory. With the concept of crisis in focus, Bill reminds us that, at least implicitly, that for those dominant or transnational capitalist forces and those that exercise state power in the core areas of global capitalism, it would be a mistake to let, from their vantage point, they have always argued it would be a mistake to allow a good crisis to go to waste. So here we are in this moment of the pandemic, here we are in this moment of the increase in the concentration and centralization of capital. The advantage is being taken at every level to facilitate that process, as we're almost single-mindedly. The contradictions, of course, for the broad mass of humanity, what Bill has called, in his discussion of the crisis of global humanity, that the idea is if we look closely at what the capitalists are doing, what is being done at the state level, especially through the transnational state apparatuses, it's by default, if you will, that ongoing process of the concentration of capital has an association with it, the deepening of inequality, the deepening of insecurity, and the fact that those who are mainly the victims of this process are, as Bill noted, not sitting on their hands. The upsurge, if you will, with respect to this disobedience, with respect to protests, with respect to assertive actions from Europe to Latin America to Asia, the Middle East and beyond, we find they're developing at the same time a growing emphasis on the instruments of repression in the context of what Bill calls digitalized dictatorship. And that is what we are actually living with. At the centerpiece of this book, therefore, is what Bill sees as a novel analysis, as he says, of the radical restructuring of the transformation of global capitalism based on a much more advanced digitalization of the entire global economy and society, and at large of the social and political struggles breaking out worldwide around this process. Therefore, conceptually and methodologically, we notice that collective agency constantly shapes and reshapes structures so that we don't have a linear, if you will, positivist view or interpretation of this process, but one which reflects a dialectical conception of the motion of history and change. Now, it is also clear from the argument that, as Bill notes, it is necessary to decipher the changing configuration of what Marx referred to as the metabolic rift between nature and culture. And this is really contradictory and inconsistent with the fact that we are part of nature, and it is in our interaction with one another on the world around us that we bring about particular change. But if we live as we do in a system, if you will, that is not organized to meet socially determined human needs, that is capitalism, what we find is a deepening of the rift with ecological, environmental, and other features of the crisis that are built into global capitalism. Now, it is clear for anyone who has studied the scholarly work that Bill has put out over the years, that he never writes simply for an audience of academics or scholars or intellectuals. In fact, I think it could be argued that he consistently addresses issues and problems in ways that are intelligible to a broader audience, as he is an exemplary of what I call a developed scholar intellectual activist. The book, which includes 3 chapters on the general crisis of capitalist rule to begin, it is in that space that Bill gives us a review of the economic or structural crisis of stagnation and the political crisis of state legitimacy. These two have to be grasped and appreciated together. In this context, the pandemic lockdown has worked in a number of interesting ways for the dominant forces. They have used the lockdown to try to stem the tide of resistance, opposition, and the assertiveness of the broad mass of oppressed people, signaling that even where conditions become sometimes extremely debilitating, the oppressed and exploited won't necessarily sit on their arms. While the system is pushing to an expansion through new forms of militarization, wars and conflicts, and new rounds of violent dispossession and through plunder by the state, the assertiveness of the broad global mass is itself an expression of this dialectical motion of history. Now, when Bill turns to discuss transformation of global capitalism through digitalization, he draws attention to the particular new rounds of restructuring based on a more advanced digitalization, where the entire global economy is involved. We have seen this process unfolding with intensity in recent decades. And when he moves on to the 3rd chapter about whither the global revolt, he makes it clear that the notion of market neutrality is part of a grand myth, as the market is a site of acute conflict and struggles where the transnational capitalist interests, set out to drape their own interests, which are specific or particular class interests, and cast them as the universal interests of society and humanity. And therefore, when struggles of resistance and opposition emerge against that particular vision, that particular interpretation, the tendency among the liberals and the illiberals is to interpret those forms of assertiveness as opposition to progress, as opposition to what is almost mandated, as it were, by nature, when in fact it has nothing to do with that. This particular view, of course, is consistent with what Bill discusses as the formal separation of economics from politics, and of course, under capitalism, formality which leads to the impression that we can seriously discuss democracy, human rights, and other factors as purely political matters with freedom, justice, and equality prevailing under the law of the state, and with individuals pursuing their rigid self-interest in the economic sphere, as though these are substantively discontinuous, when in fact it is a formal separation rather than an objective, formal separation rather than a substantive separation. And we know that we need that working together, or what I call economic market compulsion and state political coercion, the latter being is indispensable for this market strategy to function the way in which it is organized. Now, all of this has broader implications, of course, for politics and political life. Bill draws on my friend Adolph Reed's notion of ideology as reflecting the mechanisms that people use to describe or provide a sense of their material interests. But this is not a neutral process at all. It is not neutral for the simple reason that the order itself works against human needs and against human interests. And I was reminded as I went through this work that the expressions of unevenness of the transnational capitalist process actually reveal and reflect a kind of intense hostility toward humanity at large. The crisis of humanity, therefore, is not limited to any one society. And as I think of this, I'm reminded of an argument that Marx makes in so-called Primitive Accumulation in Volume 1, Part 8 of Capital, where he says it is impossible for one group of working people in one society to be free in substance when life in that society works against the better interests of others, whether they are the enslaved at the time or peasants or others in the world. In other words, if we view the phenomena through the lens of the national state, which is assumed to be an autonomous political space with its own national economic priorities, we make a mistake because it is necessary to break down that formal separation and understand this as part of a globally interconnected process. Now, it is worth noting here that as Bill works through these arguments in the 3 chapters of the book, he reminds us that there is no unity at this moment in the ranks of the transnational capitalist class. Now, when we look at the quandaries he discusses, and we select out, for example, the quandary on the relationship of this growing divide between certain intellectuals who once saw themselves or represented themselves as members of the left, or even as Marxists, who have gone over to this sort of negative and this negativity, which reflects alienation from the broad mass of the people. And here we are talking about those who take on the features of identitarianism, nationalism, and postmodernism, and who in that particular context hardly recognize that they are working, if you will, as sub-agents of the dominant order. Now, why do I make that particular argument? I make it because this is where Bill brings us back to Gramsci. and the concept of passive revolution, transformismo, and also statolatry. And it is in this particular context that we are able to discern how, when intellectuals who have typically or nominally adopted a progressive posture go over to the other side, so to speak, and help to thin out the ranks of organic intellectuals whose work is so important for advancing the cause of the oppressed and the exploited. And that is where we have come today in the neoliberal moment, where the emphasis is on identity, the emphasis is on equity, and attention has shifted away from exploitation, oppression, and inequality. At this particular point in time, therefore, the TCC takes advantage of this process to try to bring into the ranks through all forms of favors and privilege, if you will, while thinning out the ranks of the progressive forces, so to speak. So this then means that if we connect this process as it is unfolding to where we are today on the question of fascism, which in the 21st century does not assume features that are identical to pre-World War II fascism, or if you will, more broadly, 20th century fascism. Bill says, short of fascism, the TCC has already turned to extending the global police. Savage global inequalities are politically explosive, and to the degree that the system is simply unable to reverse them, it turns to ever more violent forms of containment to manage the immiserated populations as balance between consent and coercion shift toward the latter. The US state, as Bill notes in the latter part of the work, expects a deepening of the contradictions in the order it serves and defends. It can therefore be expected that it will continue on the path toward an unrealizable, what I call an absolute global domination, which is unrealizable. We know that hegemony itself is never absolute, and it is thus the pursuit of this dangerous, what I call an impossibilism theorem, that makes it all the more dangerous as the proxy war in Ukraine, for example, indicates. Now, I'm reminded here that some of the issues that Bill takes up, of which he provides a trenchant critique, again, returning to nationalism, identitarianism, and postmodernism. He provides a trenchant critique with attention to the anti-Marxist ideological factors that help to inform these particular tendencies that shift attention away from exploitation and inequality. He notes that if identitarianism leads to a dead end, so does the close cousin of nationalism, which obliterates class by establishing a unified identity for citizens of a particular country. And as I noted before, when we take that particular path that nationalists follow, they often find it difficult to focus on the class contradictions and related factors, focusing on the nationality of capital rather than on the causal basis of exploitation and dehumanization. Now, I would add here that it is worth, in the context on which Bill focuses, to pay some attention to what I call global white supremacy as an organizing principle of Western liberalism, which developed as modernity's philosophical doctrine, right? Now, this doctrine became hegemonic and remains the dominant form of world order. Bill discusses here 4 quandaries stemming from the global crisis. The first is what he calls the global revolt 1 that swept across different parts of the world, from the Middle East to Europe, Latin America, Asia, and beyond, paying attention to neoliberalism, matters of austerity, the growing concentration of wealth at the top, to the point where in a country like the United States, the top 1% owns and or controls almost 50% of all wealth and assets, and where some 90% of the population must fight over 5.5% of what remains. The point there is to see in more dramatic terms that this is not feasible. This is not something that can endure. From this particular vantage point, then, the question is, how does the bourgeoisie, the transnational capitalist forces, see the options before them? Bill points out that there is no particular unity in those ranks, understandably so. Intense and fierce competition continues at large, but at the same time, they know where their interests are, where they lie, and what they might do to defend them. But on the question of fascism, which Bill discusses at length in this work, it will be difficult at this moment to say that the transnational capitalist forces are of one voice or of one particular accord. And while it is important to understand that authoritarianism and fascism are not coterminous or are not one and the same, Bill points out that when he discusses the fourth quandary with attention to 21st century capitalism, he reminds us that fascism seeks to rescue capitalism from its organic crisis. We understand that. It projects a populist appeal to workers in a top-down style, offering an imaginary solution to real contradictions. He also notes in that context that the wages of fascism appear to be entirely psychological, noting that at the moment we are in, it is fundamentally an irrationality that is in play, which reflects a promise to deliver security and to restore deliver security and restore stability. This is a factor that is far more emotive than rational. It is a project that does not and need not distinguish between truth and lies. And hence you can see, as we noticed in the United States, the QAnon forces, those who see the reality and deny that it actually exists. Now, he notes that fascist projects can only forge a social base at the expense of the repressive super-exploitation and or exclusion of sectors of the population, right? Now, with this in mind then, it seems to me that, and Bill notes this very clearly, we are dealing with a process that is open-ended. We are not talking here about closures at any particular juncture, so to speak. And if such projects can only forge a base at the expense of repressive super-exploitation, the question is, where does it leave us at this particular moment? What can we expect from the transnational forces? And this is where Bill comes back to Gramsci, and where he notes that the system of domination works to decapitate and disorganize the resistance from below, popular resistance, if you will. And he draws on Gramsci again to explain how the state and transnational capitalist forces tend to visualize options in a moment of acute structural crisis in which co-optation plays an important role in buying off leadership, as we have seen with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, where a whopping $10 billion is estimated to have flowed in that particular direction, with large numbers of people who came out focusing on the question of racial oppression and not paying attention to the fundamental issues of economic exploitation on which the system fundamentally rests, right? Now, I would like to suggest then that, having talked as much as I have talked, and having tried to provide an overview of some of the salient arguments and features in this work, that it might be useful for me to stop here and let us get to some broader participation. Maybe Bill might have some comments to make to help elucidate or broaden what I have so far attempted to talk about. Bill?
Oh, I'd have loads to say, but I don't know, should we jump to questions and discussion with the audience? Or Hilborn, did you want to raise some issues that I should respond to?
Well, I think I would prefer at this moment if we opened it up, find out what else is going to come out, and then we can come back to some of those. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right. So we bring Ash back in for...
Mm-hmm.
I don't see Ash here.
I am coming back, just a moment. Okay, great. Yeah, and I know we've got about 12 people here. So if folks have questions, you can submit questions through the Q&A function at your bottom of the screen. But we don't have any questions yet. So I wonder if like Hilborn said, William, you want to pull out any threads from some of what Hilborn said, and we can start the conversation there, and folks can kind of submit questions as we get going.
Sure. Well, let me say something about the global revolt, because, you know, it's very important for us to see that the global police state. It's important to see that it's a response to this revolt from below. Let's remember that since 2008, there's been sustained resistance around the world, despite setbacks. Remember, the global financial collapse of 2008 really started this global revolt that lasted throughout the 2010s, intensified on the lead up, and then during the pandemic itself. And I want to mention, and this is in the book, of course, I want to mention that the surveys, because I speak about several different dimensions of the global crisis. One is structural or economic, chronic stagnation. We're experiencing stagflation right now. Everyone's familiar with that. But then there's also the deep political crisis of global capitalism, which is a crisis of hegemony and state legitimacy. In researching the book, I discovered that, according to one survey, 60% of millennials in the United States and 57% of Generation Z support, quote, a complete change of our economic system away from capitalism. Then worldwide, a 2020 poll, this was on the eve of the pandemic, found that a majority of people around the world, 56%, believe that capitalism is doing more harm than good. So we have this crisis of capitalist hegemony and legitimacy. A majority of people around the world don't see the system anymore as legitimate. And that's the serious problem for the ruling groups. But it's not just that crisis of hegemony. It's also a crisis for the ruling groups of mass revolt from below. Let's go back to fall of 2019 and remember what was going on. This is just a few months before the pandemic hit. It's what broke out everywhere is what I call a people spring, from the mass uprisings in Chile to Lebanon, from Iraq to India, from France to the United States, from Haiti to Nigeria to Sudan. Everywhere we looked, in 2018, 2019, building up this crescendo, there were mass uprisings. In fact, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has what they call a global, forgot what they call it, a global protest tracker. And they reported that significant anti-government protests took place between 2018 and 2020 in 110 countries involving 230 major actions that overthrew over 30 governments. So what happened, and I'm just looking for a few examples, and while we're waiting for some questions, gosh, I can't find my notes, but I wanted to give some highlights of this global revolt. In late 2019, early 2020, remember the pandemic hits in February, March of 2020. There was a general strike in India that involved 150 million people, more people than the vast majority of countries have of their entire population, a general strike. That was the single biggest labor mobilization in world history. Then then the pandemic came, everyone was sent into lockdown. And in many respects, this pandemic was a blessing in disguise for the ruling groups, because lockdown undercut this revolt all around the world. But it didn't last for long. Fast forward 1 year later, December 2020 into early 2021, another general strike in India, this time involving 250 million people. It's almost unfathomable to imagine a general strike with 250 million people. There's only 330 million people in the United States. But that's just one leading example. In the United States, in the midst of the pandemic, we had the single biggest uprising in modern US history. 25 million people took to the streets after George Floyd was murdered by the police. Now, of course, Hilborn has already referred to how I analyze the aftermath of that uprising, in which it was co-opted from above by corporations, by the state, and by professional and managerial strata among the oppressed themselves. But that was the single biggest uprising in US history. But this is repeated everywhere, all over the world. And so what I really want to emphasize here is that the ruling groups face this structural crisis. They don't know how to resolve it. The ruling groups are rudderless. They're clueless on how to resolve, to begin with, the structural crisis, the economic crisis of global capitalism. The most severe, well, some people say the most severe since the 1930s, but in many respects for me, this crisis of global capitalism structurally is even more severe because capitalism is running, it's exhausted. We're reaching the historic exhaustion of the conditions which allow this world capitalist system to reproduce itself, to continue. And the ruling groups don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. During the pandemic, they threw trillions of dollars out to try and keep the economy sputtering along. They did the same thing after 2008. So we have this economic crisis that they cannot resolve. But they also don't know how to resolve this political crisis of the revolt from below and the crisis of hegemony of capitalism itself. So in this context of political and economic crisis, we're not even talking about the ecological dimensions of the crisis, just the political and economic dimensions. Along comes digitalization, and that's a big chunk of the book. And we're all familiar with these new technologies, but maybe we're not familiar with just the extent to which they come online. I have a bit of data here, but I want to emphasize what's important about this is because digitalization allows the ruling groups to enhance the global police state. That's why I started my opening comments by pointing out that this new software, literally as you're working on your computer, it does facial recognition and it can see how hard you're concentrating. It can see how hard you're concentrating. And of course, this digital technology is not limited to those working at homes on the computer screens. They're everywhere in the world of work, and they're everywhere at every single social level. But the point is that these new digital technologies, they allow the ruling groups to extend the global police state, to heighten their control over masses of people. And many, many examples there, but I want to point out just how extensive, just how profound is the transformation involved in digitalization. And maybe everyone is not even familiar with all of these technologies. Of course, we have artificial intelligence and machine learning. We have big data, the massive collection, processing, and analysis of these immense amounts of data. But we also have automation and robotization. And increasingly, machines are replacing human labor. This has been a process going on for 200 some odd years, but a tremendous acceleration.
Right.
If there's a question comes up, please interrupt me. But so, I had in initially researching for the book said, well, robots, replace human beings in factories. You now have car factories where there's a few thousand, used to have 30, 40,000 workers in a giant auto factory. You now have 2,000, 3,000 workers, and there's all this automation and robotization. We know that. That aggravates the structural crisis because now you have no workers and no one can consume all of the wealth that capitalism produces. But when I researched for this book, I discovered that automation was going to fields which we normally don't associate with automation, such as agriculture. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles and California. Here, California is one of the big global breadbaskets. And during the pandemic, either migrants who work in the fields were not allowed into the US, or they didn't go into the fields because of the dangers of COVID. So growers didn't have a labor force here in the Central Valley in California. So they introduced what was the technology that was already developing, in which machines picked grapes in the wine industry in Sonoma County, in which machines complex machines, robotic machines, pick strawberries. So even agriculture, which we associate with intense manual labor, is being automated and robotized. And I can go on to so many different examples, but one of the things here is that this machine learning involves these algorithms in a way which we don't previously see technology. I mean, this is a qualitatively new stage in technology. It allows complex pattern recognition and communication recognition. What that means is that work that we previously also associated as cannot be robotized, such as professional work, lawyers, doctors, accountants, journalists. These can now be increasingly done by machines. So we have a situation where manual work around the world is being replaced by technology, but increasingly professional work is being replaced by technology. Then we have bio and nanotechnology. And that's why I gave the example of Pfizer CEO saying that you can now give medication to someone in which technology is implanted in the pill or in the vaccine. And then he said, relevant authorities, we don't know who that is. Capitalist from Pfizer, the state, can now monitor the patient. Again, I'm not saying that the COVID vaccines had little chips. That's a right-wing conspiracy theory. But that's the extent of this nano and biotechnology. And under very different circumstances, all of these technologies, a few others which I'll mention too, could be a tremendous welcome to humanity. Imagine what we could achieve with these technologies under a system which is not implacably driven by the drive for profit. But all of these technologies are developed and controlled and deployed by capital in pursuit of the endless accumulation of profit and of social control. We have 3D printing. We have quantum and cloud computing. We have autonomously driven land, air, and sea vehicles. We have the 5G network, augmented reality. And as long as there's no questions, Ash, I'll just continue with some data. When I researched this book, I said, well, to what extent, this digitalization been around for a while? I've been working on computers since the early 1990s. I've had a smartphone since 2006, 2007. But I was shocked to find the extent to which this digital transformation is taking place. So here is one example. Global Internet Protocol traffic. That's a proxy for data flows all around the world, these data flows. It grew from 100 gigabytes per day in 1992 to more than 45,000 gigabytes per second in 2017. And it's expected by the end of this year, 2022, to reach 150,000 gigabytes per second. So that means we have this total datafication, not just of the global economy, but of global society, of everything that takes place among us 8 billion people. And this data is not controlled by us. It's utilized, again, for implacable drive to make profit and for heightened forms of social control. So, there's much more here.
I'd love to go into a question that feels relevant to this topic, and then maybe we can hear from Hilborn as well. But Brenna in the audience asks, if there is a stronger global police state, particularly digitally, what do you think that means for the safety or success of grassroots initiatives or / uprisings that have been occurring more virtually since the pandemic?
Okay, and Hilborn might also want to respond to that, but I'm not sure about, you mean virtual uprisings? I didn't quite get that.
I imagine this person is asking about the degree to which there is a lot of organizing in grassroots social movements that takes place online.
Sure.
Yep. Right.
Yeah. So that's these technologies are a double-edged sword. They're a double-edged sword because they are developed from above and they're imposed from above, but they also open up new spaces for organizing resistance from below. So we saw, for instance, we've seen in the uprising which is going on right now in Sudan as we speak. All of these uprisings have utilized social media in a way that allows different communities to communicate with one another, to coordinate their actions. Sri Lanka, they've been using social media on a daily basis to organize the protests, which in the midst of overthrowing the Sri Lankan government. But I think there's a bigger issue here. And again, Hilborn might want to jump into this, but these contradictions of global capitalism are explosive. They're explosive. And they cannot be resolved by more and more repression, right? So the global police state might be deadly, I mean, for millions of people around the world, but it can't resolve repression. Let me go back to something that Hilborn pointed out, and then let me stop and turn over to Hilborn. So ruling groups have always had two ways of maintaining their control. And one is ideological hegemony. Masses of people internalize the culture of the dominant system and so forth, and they're passive either because they feel revolt is not possible or worthwhile, or because they've simply accepted the terms of the existing social order. But when these hegemonic mechanisms of social control break down, and that's why I read that survey, that 60% of young people in the United States consider that this system doesn't work, and 54% of people worldwide think it doesn't work. Then coercive mechanisms of social control kick in. And that's, of course, the repressive dimensions of the global police state. But when they kick in, that's a symptom of the weakness of the system, not the strength of the system. It's a reflection of the crisis of the system's rule.
Yeah. So, Marinara? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think, Bill, you have hit a very important point there. Now, since this process unfolds, since the motion is dialectical, the ruling forces don't miss an opportunity to seek to broaden their control and their influence. They seldom recognize this as also a sign of their own weakness because there is resistance. But I'm wondering about the extent to which we have had sort of perhaps not, if not necessarily a thinning out, but a weakening of the ranks of the revolutionary intellectuals and political forces. Also, we have seen, as you have made very clear in the book, that we don't have a well-organized, structured, powerful socialist, if you will, movement to help anchor these forces of resistance that emerge and sometimes don't have clear direction, where people see the particular issues that are affecting them in their daily lives, but don't necessarily make connections to the broader structural processes, right? And we know that that is very much in vogue now, especially where you look at a work which has got a lot of problems, but at the same time, there are some things you can cull from it, like Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism, right? Where she says that a great deal of emphasis now is on regulating, predicting behavior. Just as you can look at people at the work site or at a computer or some other device and look at the facial expression and try to make some sense of how they're operating, whether they're comfortable with their work or whether they're angry, whether they're hostile or whatever. There is this process that is taking place, as it were, behind the backs, seemingly behind the backs of everything, to strengthen, and deepen control. Those measures, I think, as you have said, don't necessarily signal some indomitable power or force, but rather some of the structural weaknesses within the system. The question which came up about organizing online, it would not be the first time, I think, as you note in the work, where World Social Forum forces for a while were able to meet virtually. You could have a physical meeting, but you could also meet to discuss issues because the new technology has also made it that possible to plan more effectively. But I don't know that there's any substitute in the long run, right, for getting out there really in the hustings, so to speak. And if the means at our disposal which are multifunctional, help in building that so much the better, because it is easier now, whether you are in Kuala Lumpur or whether you are in Lagos or in Prague or in London or in Los Angeles, to come together to discuss issues and to see the interconnectedness much more clearly than in decades past. And I think has an advantage, but I think for planning, but I think we also have to keep in mind that unless we can get out there and make some motion, then it remains perhaps, fairly abstract, but still been useful.
Yeah, I'll just add one observation there is that the global communications revolution actually, obviously it goes back to the late 20th century when the internet is introduced, but it's accelerated. It's reached new heights in the last few years. And what that means is that local struggles become aware of all the other local struggles around the world, that we become aware instantly about what's going on. We're all aware now what's going on right now in Sri Lanka. We're all aware of what's going on right now in the Sudan. When the uprising, when George Floyd was murdered, there was the uprising, which instantly the whole world became aware of. And there were some 60 solidarity marches and uprisings in other countries, just in solidarity with the 25 million of us that took to the streets in the United States. So there's clearly a revolutionary potential for the use of this new technology. But as Hilborn says, using this technology to mobilize and resist doesn't replace the actual real world mobilization and resistance. It simply is a new mechanism to facilitate that.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to ask, we have someone on the Facebook live stream who asked a question about COVID denial and conspiracy theories. So William, I know there's so much covered in this book, and we've been talking about the digital technologies, but you also talk pretty extensively about big pharma and vaccines. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about, because you named sort of millennials and Gen Z before, and the degree to which people don't believe capitalism will work anymore and want a new economic system. And then when you talk about big pharma and the pandemic and vaccines, there's a potential future that you kind of lay out for what that could look like. And some of the ways in which big pharma was ready for a moment, for a pandemic moment, to sort of roll out vaccines. And this person in particular on Facebook is asking if any of the COVID denial or conspiracy theories was a means to split working class resistance and prevent some of this revolt or uprising that we've been talking about, this organizing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. It's a really, really important question, and there is a problem here. The problem is that the right wing, the far right, has had its agenda with regard to COVID and regard to these vaccines. And so that we have to be aware of. But the problem is that those of us on the left then say, because the right wing has this agenda, therefore, we're not going to have a leftist agenda with regard to COVID and regard to big pharma and regard to the pandemic. And that's been a big mistake. And part of that mistake is that when we critique the official narrative of COVID that has been handed down from above by the transnational capitalist class and by the capitalist state, when we critique that narrative, we're accused of identifying with the right wing, which is not in the least bit true. Whether or not COVID-19 was made in a laboratory and released accidentally, absolutely not on purpose, that would not be rational, logical, or whether it was actually, transferred from a bat to human beings is irrelevant. The point is, there's 2 points here. The first is, as you sort of indicated in that question, in phrasing that question, Ash, is that for many years now, for over 20 years, the ruling groups, and I'm talking about the ruling groups, I'm talking about the medical industrial complex, big pharma, and their links to the capitalist state and the institutions of the capitalist state have been readying for a pandemic. They've been salivating for a pandemic because it means enormous profit making. And so right from the beginning, the official response, again, of capital and the capitalist state was to turn this pandemic into a massive money-making operation, a massive profit-making operation, number one, and to utilize the pandemic to intensify social control. Okay, and we cannot lose sight of that. That meant that any and every response to the health emergency, this is a deadly virus, right? And it required a public health response around the world. But the ruling groups determined that any and every response would be one based on maximizing profit and suppressing any response that would undermine the maximization of profit. So that meant there was only one medical solution, which is patented vaccines. I want to say something about Pfizer here. Pfizer made in 2021 $32 billion in profit. That compares to $8 billion in profit in previous years. So it almost 500-fold increase just in Pfizer's profit making. Their revenues were $81 billion. To put that into context, the total amount spent in the United States on education in the federal, state, and local level, the total amount is $124 billion. So Pfizer's revenues, $81 billion, is 2/3 of every penny spent on education in the United States. So there's much, much, much more going on here. Prior to COVID, the ruling groups, again, I'm talking about the giant pharmaceutical corporations, but beyond them, the medical industrial complex. And we have to remember that, and that's why in chapter 2, that big thick chapter on digitalization, I'm showing this new block of capital, which are the giant tech companies, and I'm including the pharmaceutical companies because it's biotechnology now. The tech companies, finance, and the military industrial complex form this triangulated power block, and that's the dominant power block now. And they have been wanting to create global vaccine markets, not because they care or not care about the health of the world's people or anything, but because it's enormously profitable. So they have been planning for this for a very long time. Along comes COVID. Okay. It's released into the population, and now they put all of these plans into action. I want to point out something, for instance, and I know this is controversial, but the reason it shouldn't be controversial to the left. The reason it's controversial is I want to repeat, the right has its agenda. We all know the agenda of the right, and therefore leftists get confused by saying, because the right has that agenda, we will swallow the official narrative. Okay, and so I'm going to give an example. I don't care if I'm delegitimated because this is important for us to see. We know, and this is the science. I'm concerned about the actual science. Okay. The science says that if by chance you got COVID and you weren't vaccinated before the vaccines existed or before you could get your vaccination, I'm fully vaccinated, by the way. If you did get COVID, you got natural antibodies. That's how our system works, our immune system, our species, all species got natural antibodies. And if you have these natural antibodies, the science tells us this isn't debatable. CDC, FDA, they don't debate this. The natural antibodies are more robust than the antibodies that a vaccine gives you. So if I didn't have COVID, I want that vaccine. The vaccine will give me antibodies and help protect me. But if I happen to have gotten COVID before I could get a vaccine or before they were invented, and I survived it, I have natural antibodies that are even stronger. So I didn't need the vaccine. So that was suppressed. The reason it's suppressed is because you don't make profit by saying, you get a vaccine, you don't have it, but you did get COVID, so you don't need it, you're okay. That would undermine profit. The project here, and all of this was laid out, by the way, some of it is in the book. In chapter 1 of the book, when I discussed the pandemic, I've continued to research and I've continued to deepen this, my knowledge of all of this. But for 20 some odd years, this ruling block of giants, medical industrial, the foundations, especially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the state agencies and so forth, had been running these scenarios for how they would respond to a real pandemic. And these scenarios are nightmarish in terms of the control from above. I want to say something else. Again, you're going to have to shut me off when we're out of time or if there's other questions. But there's something else. it is true, I want to repeat, it is true there's a right-wing agenda which involves dis and misinformation, involves mobilizing the right wing in the name of, of this pandemic. And we want to combat that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a leftist analysis of what's going on with this pandemic and a leftist response to it. So there has been mis and disinformation. But the powers that be that are controlling this narrative from above have labeled anything which undermines profit-making, anything which questions the official narrative, even if it's completely based in science and in evidence, as mis and disinformation, and have been massively censoring. And that censorship now, forget about the pandemic now, that censorship is now in place. It's now been legitimated through the pandemic, and it's going to be and is being used as a tax on the left in general. If you now can't publish anything that contravenes the official narrative on Russia and the Ukraine, not that I support the invasion of Ukraine, not at all. And across the board, that censorship is now a heightened weapon against us, the masses of working class and poor and popular people struggling around the world, and intellectuals associated with that resistance. So really, the pandemic in many ways is a turning point. It's a turning point in this global civil war. It's a turning point in the onslaught of what I called the digitalized dictatorship. And it involves all of these not just political, but ideological and informational dimensions, which the left has to get a grip on and has not. Let me, read you something. This was, again, all of these scenarios that, again, the pharmaceutical corporations, the state, the foundations, they all came together for these scenarios that started in the late 1990s. And this was a lockstep scenario in 2010. Listen to this. Again, these are the ruling groups saying, if there's a pandemic, this is how we're going to deal with it. So this is a quote from, and it's in the book in chapter 1. 2010, they held this imaginary coronavirus pandemic. 2010, right? 10 years before the pandemic actually hit. And this is what their lockstep scenario, their imaginary scenario concluded. I'm quoting directly from it. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries of communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. That's exactly what's happening post-pandemic now. That was 2010. Then 2019, fall of 2019, 3 months before the pandemic hit, another scenario. Now, this is not us from below doing this, right? Radical academics like me and Hilborn and people involved in social movements. These are the ruling groups from the highest levels. They had another one. And after this scenario, they issued these recommendations. Listen carefully to these recommendations, because this is exactly what happened. Quote, governments, international organizations, and businesses should plan for how essential corporate, not public, corporate capabilities will be utilized during a large-scale pandemic. Governments should partner with private media corporations to develop the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. Trusted, influential, private sector employers should create capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and amplify credible information to support emergency public communications. Media companies should commit, now that's big global capital, media companies, to commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. So the bottom line here is that this global health emergency facilitated not only a massive transfer of wealth to the rich and the transnational capitalist class, but it heightened their power. It allowed the ruling groups to impose a state of exception, enhance surveillance and control through the global police state, accelerate this restructuring, and go back to the technology they're now using when people work at home in computers. They can literally monitor our face and how productive we are through looking at our face. So, you know, I could go on, but this issue of the pandemic, the left has not stepped up to the plate with a leftist analysis of the pandemic and what it's meant.
I think, Bill, remember we had a conversation several weeks ago, maybe it's in the last 2 months, when we talked briefly about Kennedy's book On the Real Dr. Fauci.
Yes,
right.
I remember that.
Yeah, and a work that is worth looking at. You know, in very broad terms, to understand part of what you have just presented there, right? But it seems to me also that one of the things that comes into much more, if you will, much more stark relief are the limits of liberal democracy in this particular context, right? So that those who assume that liberalism as a philosophy is an end in itself, rather than as part of this process of struggle to try to make sense of the world and what are the spaces afforded there for heightening consciousness and understanding and so on, which this transnational capitalist forces in the state, as you have just said, see as a need to get into the void, if you will, and to further reduce that space. Because the emphasis here is on the strengthening of corporate power, right? And the role of the state is significant for that strengthening to take place. So we see, even if one argued that one of the important things that state sovereignty has been used for is to defend and protect the right to exploit, we see here also working to intensify the right to oppress and dominate, right? So we have to rethink the paradigm of liberal democracy and to focus more on what we see through the upsurge of these popular struggles to make it more feasible for democracy to be understood as a movement of struggle from below, rather than a top-down kind of thing, right? Because here we don't have what Slavoj Žižek calls a non-negotiable ground zero of freedom, right? Where metaphorically, if you're going to construct a skyscraper and you have got to go 6 stories down and put the girders and the pylons in, when you reach street level, you don't say, we made a mistake, we need to go back. Because you can't go up to 20 and 30 and 40 floors on a rickety foundation. And the point here then is that if you bring that to bear on the discourse about democracy in modern capitalist society, we see that it is not organized around this broad fundamental question of meeting human needs, right? And having a non-negotiable framework. In other words, whatever struggles are won, they're always subject to some form of reversibility, right? And I think this helps to bring that out today with the relative ease with which the pandemic has been exploited. But as you have set forth there, they were planning before the pandemic erupted to anticipate what could happen in the process and therefore give themselves a greater advantage, right? Because the balance of forces have shifted in favor of the dominant.
Well, yes and no. Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant point you're raising, but through the pandemic, it shifted back up to the ruling groups, momentarily the balance of forces.
Yeah.
But that's momentary because ruling groups cannot maintain control. That's why, you know, the title of the book, Global Civil War.
Indeed.
You're touching on something critical, which you also mentioned in your presentation, Hilborn, which is, of course, that these consensual mechanisms of ruling class control, bourgeois democracy, liberal democracy, whatever you want to call it, they're breaking down. They're breaking down in the face of the crisis. And so we're moving at a generalized level worldwide to authoritarianism, in some cases outright dictatorship, and the threat of the actual threat of fascism. But as you just pointed out, the pandemic has accelerated that. It's in some senses normalized more authoritarian forms of state control and capitalist control right in front of our eyes. But I want to always bring home the point that they are doing this in reaction to the revolt from below.
Indeed.
I want to make a point really quick, a follow-up there, Hilborn, that really what the pandemic allowed the ruling groups to do is to declare medical martial law and unleash this wave of repression in the name of public health to suppress that global revolt when again it was reaching a crescendo. Indeed. In 2019 and the first couple of months of 2020. You know, I want to run through, this will be very quick, but I want to run through some, in country after country, every single government used emergency powers in the name of public health to ban protests, to harass dissidents, to censor journalists, to scapegoat minority groups. 158 countries declared medical martial law. And why did they do that? To not just for public health, maybe not in the first instance, even for public health, but to suppress that revolt. So in Egypt, right at the beginning, 12 doctors immediately thrown into jail for criticizing the government. In Nicaragua, anybody that reported any news that was considered causing alarm, fear, or anxiety was criminalized. In Zimbabwe, this is, okay, these are all the emergency measures supposedly for public health, but these are countries where there were mass revolts underway. In Zimbabwe, anyone that published what the government considered false information, not just with COVID, anything, was threatened with 20-year jail terms. The Bulgarian authorities, they implemented harsher lockdowns in Romani neighborhoods than in other neighborhoods. In Turkey and Montenegro and Serbia, governments arrested and fined people charged with publishing information on the social media that, quote, jeopardizes public security, even when that information had nothing to do with COVID. It was like to say what the government was doing. In France, citizens had to carry around during the lockdown documents proving the right to be outside. They were fined and arrested. The Kenyan government, they implemented this wave of repression. I gave one example in the book in Mombasa, the big coastal port city in Mombasa. Security forces tear gassed and beat crowds of people that were trying to board ferries to get home when the government said, you got to lock yourself down. In a number of countries, concentration camps were set up in El Salvador, in Peru, in other countries in Latin America, concentration camps that housed tens of thousands of people because and the people thrown into there, they violated the lockdown. In Honduras, you know, now has a leftist government. They won the last elections. The left progressive government won the elections. But in the midst of the pandemic, there's this far-right dictatorial government that had come to power by a coup, supported by the United States. The Honduran government declared a state of emergency in the name of fighting COVID, and they used that to arrest hundreds of dissidents that had nothing to do with the health emergency that had been organizing the social movements in Honduras. So just as you said, Hilborn, we see this slide into authoritarianism and even dictatorship, and we see how the pandemic, in the name of fighting for public health, utilized that pandemic to crack down on this revolt. But the good news is that even during the pandemic, after 2 or 3 months, the revolt picked up once again. And now we're on the precipice of a new global recession, even a depression. That is that temporarily during the pandemic, the economy functions because governments were printing, especially US government, printing and injecting trillions of dollars into the economy. But now we have hyperinflation. Now the whole world economy is on the edge of another recession, maybe even a depression. The collapse of cryptocurrencies, the imminent collapse of financial systems around the world, unbelievable amounts of public and private debt, unprecedented level of debts. We're headed towards an unbelievable economic crisis. And remember, it's at times of severe crisis that social and political struggles break out like never before. So we're moving into this period of global civil war. That's exactly why I titled the book in this way. And the danger of the civil war is that there's progressive and leftist resistance worldwide, but there's also that right-wing project, which is gaining ground worldwide in the face of the crisis. And so our future hangs in the balance right now.
Yeah, so I'd say make 2 other points here, Bill. Clearly then, there is no evidence that capital and the state have won any definitive absolute struggles from above against the broad mass of working people and working class people from below. And in that context, the future remains to be made.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. that may be as good a place as any to leave it off. Did you have a final thought there you wanted to share, William?
No, I'm good.
No, it remains to be made, and let's make it from below.
Precisely.
Absolutely. Well, Hilborn, William, thank you so much for sharing your insights tonight and being here to talk with us. For folks in the audience, anyone who registered for this event will get a follow-up email with a recording. So I know we covered a lot of ground here. There were even a few more questions here that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to, but you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of the event, so you'll be able to watch it again. And if you haven't picked up the book yet, I hope that you will. All of the information plus much more that was discussed tonight is contained in this book. And like Hilborn said, it's a very accessible read. So written kind of for everyone to understand. And I hope you'll pick up a copy. I dropped a link there in the chat. So yeah, again, Hilborn, William, thanks so much for spending this time with us tonight, and hope to see you somewhere down the line.
Thank you,
Thank
Ash.
you so much.
Definitely.
Thank you, Ash. Thank
Okay.
you, Firestorm.
Thanks a lot.
For sure. All right, have a good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Good night.